It started as a simple act of kindness. John saw a young woman stranded by the roadside and decided to help. But what seemed like an innocent ride home quickly spiraled into a nightmare he never saw coming. The moment she stepped out of the car, everything changed, and John found himself at the center of a shocking accusation that could destroy his life. Trapped. Accused. Arrested. With no way to prove his innocence, he watched helplessly as his world crumbled. But just when all hope seemed lost, an unexpected twist turned the tables. This story will leave you speechless. Watch until the end to see the shocking truth revealed. Do you think John should have stopped to help? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. John was a kind man who believed in helping others. He worked hard every day and enjoyed simple things in life. He loved to come home after a long day, relax with a warm cup of tea, and reflect on the good he had done. One evening, as he drove home from work, he noticed a young woman standing by the roadside. She looked tired and worried, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to shield herself from the cold evening breeze. The road was almost empty, and the sun had started to set, casting a golden hue across the sky. John slowed down and rolled down his window, wondering if she needed help. The woman turned her head, her eyes filled with uncertainty and a hint of desperation. "Do you need a lift?" he asked with a smile, trying to sound as friendly as possible so she wouldn't be afraid. The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, please. I need to get to the next town," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing he could help someone in need. He reached over and unlocked the passenger door, gesturing for her to get in. As she settled into the seat, he couldn't help but notice the way she avoided eye contact, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her dress. It crossed his mind that she might be in trouble, but he chose not to ask too many questions. Sometimes, people just needed kindness without explanation. Little did he know, this simple act of goodwill would soon turn into a nightmare. The drive started in complete silence. John focused on the road while Bella sat stiffly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at her phone. The dim glow of the streetlights illuminated the path ahead, and John noticed that the air inside the car felt thick with unease. He attempted to lighten the mood. "So, are you visiting someone in the next town?" he asked, trying to engage her in conversation. She looked up, her lips pressing together before she responded. "Something like that," she muttered, her voice flat and emotionless. John noticed her fingers tapping anxiously on her knee, as if she was counting the seconds until they arrived. He found her behavior a little odd, but he didn't want to pry. Everyone had their own struggles, and he didn't want to make her uncomfortable. Instead, he turned his attention back to the road, convinced that once he dropped her off, the tension in his chest would fade. However, his instincts were whispering to him, warning him that something wasn't quite right. As they neared the town, Bella sat up straighter, suddenly appearing more alert. "Drop me off near that small shop," she instructed, pointing ahead. John nodded, slowing the car down as he approached the location. As soon as the vehicle came to a halt, she turned to him with an unreadable expression. "You have to pay me now," she said. John blinked, taken aback by her words. "Pay you," he repeated, his brows furrowing. "For what?" Bella sighed dramatically and crossed her arms. "For my time. The money we agreed on," she stated firmly. John's mouth fell open in shock. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice filled with genuine confusion. Bella's demeanor shifted instantly. Her eyes darkened, and she leaned closer. "Don't play dumb. We had a deal. If you don't pay up, I'll make sure you regret it," she threatened. John's pulse quickened. "Listen, I was just trying to help you." "There was no deal," he protested. Before he could say another word, she suddenly pushed open the car door and let out a chilling scream. The street, which had been quiet moments before, suddenly came alive. Pedestrians turned their heads, startled by the commotion. Bella stumbled backward, pointing at John with wide, tear-filled eyes. He promised me money for our time together, and now he's refusing to pay, she wailed. John's stomach dropped. What? That's not true, he shouted, stepping out of the car, but the damage had already been done. The people surrounding them looked at him with suspicion and judgment, whispering among themselves. A man pulled out his phone to call the police, while others shook their heads in disapproval. John could hardly breathe as he realized the full weight of the situation. He had been framed. The moment the police officers stepped out of their patrol car, John felt as if the world had started spinning too fast. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the worried and curious faces of the growing crowd. The woman, Bella, continued to sob loudly, her face buried in her hands as she painted herself as the victim. John opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but before he could utter a word, an officer grabbed his arm. "Sir, you're under arrest," the officer announced, his tone firm and unyielding. John's heart pounded as cold metal cuffs were locked around his wrist. "Wait. This is a mistake. I was just giving her a ride," he protested, his voice filled with desperation. But his words seemed to vanish in the air, unheard and ignored. The murmurs from the crowd only made it worse. Strangers pointed at him, whispering accusations he couldn't defend himself against. The look of pity in some faces and disgust in others made him feel smaller than ever. How had things turned so terribly wrong so quickly? The police officers didn't bother to listen to his protests. They escorted him to the patrol car, their grips firm as if he were a dangerous criminal. Bella stood a few feet away, her tears flowing freely as she continued her act. "I trusted him," she whimpered, shaking her head as if she had been betrayed. John clenched his fists, anger and frustration boiling inside him. "She's lying," he yelled as the officers pushed him toward the back seat of the police car. One officer turned to Bella. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. Bella sniffled dramatically, nodding. "Yes, he promised to pay me, and now he's refusing. This isn't right. He can't just use me and leave," she said, her voice trembling as if she had been truly wronged. John couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mind screamed at him to fight back, to demand justice, but what could he say? No one believed him. The truth didn't seem to matter. As the police car doors shut, he could barely breathe. The realization of what was happening sank deep into his bones. He was being taken to jail for something he didn't do. The ride to the police station felt like the longest journey of his life. His thoughts raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. Who would believe him? He had no proof, no witnesses to confirm his innocence. Would he lose everything over this one act of kindness? His mind replayed the moment he had stopped for Bella, wishing he had ignored her standing by the roadside. But it was too late for regrets now. His hands shook slightly as he looked down at the cold steel cuffs around his wrist. He was trapped, powerless, and alone. His only hope was that somehow, some way, the truth would come out before it was too late. John sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, his mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. The hard metal bench beneath him was uncomfortable, but the discomfort in his heart was far worse. The walls around him felt as if they were closing in, suffocating him with the weight of injustice. Every sound echoed through the jail, from the distant clanking of bars to the murmured conversations of other detainees. He could hear the occasional laughter from the officers on duty, their voices carefree, as if they hadn't just thrown an innocent man behind bars. He buried his head in his hands, frustration boiling inside him. How could this be happening? He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, treated like a criminal while Bella walked free. He thought of his family, his mother, his siblings. What would they think? The mere thought of disappointing them sent a sharp pang through his chest. He had to get out of here. But how? Hours passed like days, and John remained restless, his mind consumed with fear and anger. He replayed the scene over and over, wondering if he could have done anything differently. Maybe if he had been more cautious, if he had trusted his instincts when he sensed something was off about Bella. But kindness had blinded him. Now, that same kindness had landed him in a place where no one cared about the truth. a loud voice interrupted his thoughts. "John Carter," an officer called out. John looked up, his heart hammering in his chest. Was he about to be questioned? Was someone here to help? He slowly rose to his feet as the officer unlocked the cell. "Come with me," the officer said, his expression unreadable. John followed, hoping, praying, that this was the beginning of his chance to prove his innocence. He was led into a small interrogation room, where another officer sat across a table, reviewing papers. "John Carter," the officer repeated, looking up at him. "You've been accused of refusing to pay for services rendered. The victim has given her statement, and we have witnesses who claim they saw her crying." John shook his head vigorously. "This is all a lie. I never agreed to anything with her. I was just giving her a ride because she needed help," he pleaded, his voice thick with frustration. The officer studied him for a long moment before leaning forward. "Do you have any proof? Any witnesses who can confirm your story?" John opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no one. The hopelessness of his situation weighed heavily on him. The officer sighed. "Without evidence, your word means nothing against us," he said. John clenched his fists, feeling trapped. Was this how his life was going to end? Branded a criminal for something he didn't do. His future seemed bleak unless, somehow, the truth found its way to the light. John sat in the interrogation room, his mind racing. He had never imagined he would find himself in such a terrible situation. The officer sitting across from him had an expression that was hard to read, part skepticism, part boredom. "I'm telling the truth," John pleaded, his voice filled with frustration. "I picked her up because she needed a ride. There was no deal, no money, nothing like that." The officer sighed and tapped his pen against the desk. "That's not what she says," he replied. "Bella claims you picked her up with full knowledge of her services and then refused to pay after taking advantage of her time." John shook his head vigorously. "That's a lie. She's setting me up. Please, you must believe me." The officer leaned back, studying him carefully. "The problem, Mr. Carter, is that right now, all we have are two different stories. She's given a convincing testimony, and there are people who saw her crying after leaving your car. Without evidence or a witness on your side, it's going to be very hard to prove otherwise." John felt a wave of despair wash over him. How could he prove something that didn't happen? He wished he had recorded his conversation with Bella, had taken a picture, anything. But why would he have done that? He had only been trying to help. His head fell into his hands, his fingers gripping his hair. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "There has to be a way to prove my innocence." The officer glanced at the clock on the wall and then back at John. "Right now, you're being held until we can gather more information," he said, standing up. "If we don't find any evidence in your favor, you might be facing charges." The words hit John like a punch to the stomach. "Charges," he repeated in disbelief. "But I did nothing wrong." The officer shrugged. "That's not for me to decide. If you have someone who can back up your story, now would be the time to call them." John swallowed hard. Who could he call? His friends and family weren't there when he picked up Bella. There was no one. He was completely alone. As the officer left the room, John felt more helpless than ever. The walls seemed to close in on him, the fluorescent lights above flickering slightly as if mocking his misery. He had never been in trouble with the law before, never even gotten a parking ticket. Now, he was sitting in a police station, facing accusations that could ruin his life. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if he got convicted? What if he went to prison for something he didn't do? His stomach twisted at the thought. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Think, John, think," he muttered under his breath. He needed a way out of this nightmare. And then, like a distant light in the darkness, a tiny shred of hope surfaced. Maybe, just maybe, someone had seen what really happened. If there was even one witness who could confirm his story, he might still have a chance to clear his name. John sat in the cold room, his mind racing in circles, when suddenly, an officer returned and gestured for him to follow. His heart pounded as he was led down a long hallway toward another part of the station. He didn't know whether to feel fear or hope. Had they found something? Or was this just another step toward his doom? The officer guided him into another room where a different detective sat waiting, flipping through some papers. "John Olomini, sit down," the detective instructed. His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. John obeyed, swallowing the lump in his throat. "We have a new development," the detective said, locking eyes with him. "A man just walked into the station claiming he saw you pick up Bella by the roadside. He insists he witnessed the whole thing." John's eyes widened in shock. "What? Someone actually saw me?" he asked, barely able to believe it. The detective nodded. "Yes. He says he was sitting at a shop across the street when he noticed Bella waving at cars. He saw you stop, roll down your window, and offer her a ride. He swears you never discussed money or any kind of agreement with her. He even remembers seeing you hesitate before letting her in, as if you were unsure." Relief flooded John's chest, but he wasn't out of danger yet. "Does this mean I can go?" he asked, his voice trembling with hope. The detective didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. "It strengthens your case, but it doesn't completely clear you," he admitted. "Bella is still sticking to her story, and the officers on the scene witnessed her in distress. However, this new statement does cast doubt on her claims." John clenched his fists, frustration battling with the first real hope he had felt since his arrest. "Please, you have to believe me. I've never met Bella before today. I was just trying to be kind," he pleaded. The detective studied him for a moment before exhaling heavily. "Look, John. The truth is, cases like this are tricky. People are quick to believe the victim, and without solid proof, it's hard to fight accusations like this. But..." He glanced down at the report in front of him. "The witness's statement is strong, and if we can find any other evidence, like security footage, we might be able to get you out of here." John's heart pounded in his chest. "So what now?" he asked, eager for any sign that his nightmare was nearing an end. The detective stood up. "For now, we'll question Bella again. If her story starts falling apart under pressure, we may be able to get the charges dropped. Stay put, and let's see where this leads." John nodded, gripping the edge of his chair. He wasn't free yet, but for the first time since this nightmare began, he had a reason to hope. John sat anxiously in the holding cell, his heart thudding in his chest as he waited for any update. The minutes felt like hours, stretching endlessly in his mind. His hands clenched and unclenched as he replayed everything in his head. He had always believed that truth would prevail, but now, he wasn't so sure. What if Bella's lies were stronger than the truth? He shook his head, pushing the thought away. He had to believe that justice would find a way. Just then, the door creaked open, and the same detective walked in, his face unreadable. "We just finished questioning Bella again," the detective said, crossing his arms. "Her story is starting to fall apart. She got nervous when we pressed her about the details and contradicted herself multiple times. That, along with the witness statement, is making us question her claims." John exhaled sharply, a flicker of hope rising in him. "So, does this mean I can go?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. The detective shook his head. "Not yet, but we're getting closer. We need something stronger to completely disprove her allegations." John felt frustration creeping back in. "But you just said her story is crumbling. Isn't that enough?" The detective sighed. "It's a good start, but we need undeniable proof to overturn an accusation like this. We are working on it." John gritted his teeth. He understood the importance of evidence, but it was maddening to sit and wait while his life dangled on the edge of ruin. "What about the security footage?" he asked suddenly. "You mentioned it earlier." The detective nodded. "We've sent a team to check for any nearby surveillance cameras. If we're lucky, One of them caught what really happened. John clung to that hope like a lifeline. It was his best shot at clearing his name. And Bella, he asked. What happens to her if it turns out she lied? The detective gave a small shrug. That depends. If we can prove she knowingly made a false accusation, she could face legal consequences. But let's focus on getting you out first. John nodded, though he couldn't help but wonder, would she really walk away free after putting him through this nightmare? Time continued to crawl by, each second stretching his patience thinner. He could hear voices outside, muffled but tense, as officers moved around the station. He tried to stay calm, but the weight of the situation pressed on his chest. Then, suddenly, an officer rushed in, a look of urgency on his face. We found something, he announced. The detective immediately straightened. What is it? The officer held up a small tablet and played a video. John leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat as he watched. It was grainy, but clear enough, footage from a shop security camera, capturing the exact moment he had pulled over to pick Bella up. The video showed her approaching his car, leaning in, and then stepping inside, without any argument or exchange of money. John felt a surge of relief wash over him. That's it. That proves I didn't agree to anything. The detective studied the video, nodding slowly. It definitely pokes holes in her story, he admitted. We need to show this to the prosecutor. This could be the breakthrough we needed. John clenched his fists, his heart pounding with renewed hope. He wasn't free yet, but now, for the first time, he truly believed the truth would set him free. John sat in the cold, dimly lit room, his heart pounding as he waited for the next development. His fate was hanging by a thread, but for the first time since this nightmare began, there was a glimmer of hope. The detective had taken the security footage to the prosecutor, and now, John had no choice but to wait. He glanced at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick by slowly. Every minute felt like an eternity. He thought about his life before this ordeal, his job, his friends, his simple daily routines. Now, everything had changed. Just then, the door swung open, and the detective walked in, his face unreadable. John, we have news, he said, setting a file down on the table. John swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. Good news or bad news, he asked cautiously. The detective sat down and looked him in the eye. The footage is solid proof that you never made any agreement with Bella. The prosecutor is reviewing it now, but things are looking good for you. John exhaled deeply, his body sagging with relief. So does this mean I can finally go home? The detective hesitated. Not just yet. We still need to go through the official process, and Bella is still holding on to her story. But with the video and the witness statement, it's becoming harder for her to keep up the lie. John clenched his fist. She has to face the consequences for this, he said firmly. She almost ruined my life. The detective nodded. If we can prove she knowingly fired a false report, she could be charged for it. But first, let's focus on clearing your name completely. John sighed, leaning back in his chair. He hated that he was still stuck in this mess, but at least things were moving in the right direction. The detective stood up. I'll be back soon with more updates. Hang in there. As he left, John closed his eyes, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't free yet, but he could feel the weight on his chest beginning to lift. Meanwhile, in another room, Bella sat across from two officers, her confidence beginning to crack. They played the footage for her, watching her reaction closely. She shifted in her seat, her hands fidgeting. I don't remember it like that, she stammered. Maybe the camera missed some things. One of the officers raised an eyebrow. Bella, the footage is clear. You got into his car willingly. There was no argument, no discussion about money. Are you sure you want to keep up this story? She bit her lip, her eyes darting around as she realized her web of lies was unraveling. I just thought, she trailed off, unable to finish. The officers exchanged glances before one of them spoke. Bella, if you knowingly fired a false report, you could be in serious trouble. lying to the police is a crime. This is your last chance to tell the truth. Bella's hands trembled as she lowered her head. The pressure was closing in, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. The truth was finally catching up to her. Bella sat in the interrogation room, her hands trembling as she avoided the officer's piercing gazes. The weight of her life pressed down on her like a boulder, making it hard to breathe. She had never expected things to spiral this far. What started as a desperate attempt to escape her own mistakes had now become a full-blown crime. The evidence against her was overwhelming, first the witness, and now the security footage. She knew the walls were closing in. Bella, one of the officers said firmly, "This is your last chance to tell the truth. If you continue lying, things will only get worse for you." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She felt a lump in her throat, a mix of fear and regret. I didn't think it would go this far," she whispered finally. The officers exchanged looks. "So you admit it?" one asked, leaning forward. Bella hesitated before nodding slowly. "I lied," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "John never promised me money. I just didn't know how else to get out of my situation. I panicked." The room was silent for a moment before the officer spoke again. "Do you realize the gravity of what you've done? You accused an innocent man of a serious crime. He could have lost everything, his freedom, his reputation, his future." Bella's face crumpled with shame. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I was desperate. I thought if I said that, I could get some money and fix my problems. But I never meant for him to actually get arrested." The officer shook his head. "Intentions don't erase the damage you caused. The truth only came out because of the security footage and the witness. If we hadn't found that evidence, John could have been punished for something he didn't do." Bella lowered her head, tears spilling onto her lap. "I just wanted a way out. I wasn't thinking straight." The officer sighed, closing the file in front of him. "We'll be forwarding your confession to the prosecutor. There will be consequences, Bella. Lying to law enforcement is a crime, and filing a false report has serious penalties." Meanwhile, John sat in his holding cell, his mind racing. He had been waiting for what felt like forever, unsure of what was happening. Then, at last, the detective returned. "John," he said with a small smile, "you're free to go." John blinked in disbelief. "What? Are you serious?" The detective nodded. Bella finally confessed. "Between the video, the witness, and her own admission, there's no case against you anymore." Relief flooded John's body as he stood up, his legs shaking from exhaustion. "Thank God," he breathed. "I thought my life was over." The detective led him out of the cell and toward the station's front desk. "You should know," he added, "Bella will be facing legal consequences for her actions. It won't undo what happened to you, but at least justice is being served." John nodded, his heart still heavy. He had spent days trapped in a nightmare, all because of one lie. As he stepped outside, he inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He was free, but the scars of this ordeal would remain. The world had felt like a cruel, unjust place, but in the end, the truth had won. And that, at least, was something to hold on to. John's case was finally closed, and he was cleared of all wrongdoing. But even as he walked free, he knew that his life would never be the same. The experience had changed him, leaving scars that could not be seen but were deeply felt. The world had shown him how quickly things could turn upside down and how dangerous a single lie could be. He had lost trust in people, and he knew it would take time to heal. Yet, through it all, he had learned an important lesson: always be careful about the situations you put yourself in. Helping others is good, but one must be wise and cautious in doing so. The case also served as a lesson to society. Bella's false accusation had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. It reminded everyone that lies, no matter how small, have consequences. Making false claims not only hurts the accused but also weakens real cases where people are truly in danger. Justice prevailed in John's case, but not everyone is so lucky. This story highlighted the importance of truth, integrity, and the responsibility we all have to be honest in our dealings with others. Most importantly, John's story showed that no matter how dark things seem, the truth will always have a way of coming out. Lies may cause temporary damage, but truth stands strong in the end. It is a reminder that doing what is right, even when it is hard, is always the best path. And for those who find themselves in difficult situations, this story teaches one final lesson: never lose faith, because justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find its way. Thanks for watching. Do not miss our next suspense-filled story. Click the subscribe button and turn on notification to get updates when we upload our next story.